So the Dutch came and they wanted to set up a base where they could refuel their ships. So to provide it with, I don't know, whatever food it needed and water. So they literally started out by setting up that base, and gradually they expanded. But they were expanding to feed the base, to feed the ships. It wasn't quite capitalism. They were taking land. As white farmers moved out, they were taking land. But there was also actually like an underclass of white soldiers that used to mix with slaves. So you had like, even in the Dutch society, you had different classes. So you would have the ruling class, which were like the officials. You'd have an underclass in Dutch society, which were actually soldiers that were brought out from Europe that were unemployed. They pulled them into there. You also had slaves that were brought from Asia that were there, and also Khoikhoi. But it wasn't quite what we know as modern capitalism. So it expanded gradually. And by 1800s, it was about there. That was the Cape Colony. The rest was independent African societies, whether it's the Zulu, the Pedi, also. And what gradually happened is there was a war in Europe. The British took over because they wanted the Cape Town to refuel their ships, and they didn't want France, who they were fighting against the war, to have it. So it eventually stretched the Cape Colony to about here. You had people that were Dutch, they didn't like the British ruling class, and they left, and they obviously went into what today is like Mpumalanga, Limpopo. But it still wasn't capitalist, because you had many societies, especially the Pedi, that were not conquered. You had the Zulu that weren't conquered yet. This is by the 1860s. You had the isiXhosa and the Pondo land wasn't conquered. You had Lesotho wasn't conquered. You had wars all the time because the white farmers were expanding, but it wasn't capitalism. They were getting land to survive. So that even though they were taking over, it was colonialism. It wasn't quite linked to capitalism yet. So you still had the Tswana that were also independent. Something happened, comrades, that changed South African society, and it brought about what we know or knew as apartheid. The comrades know what it was. It was in 1860. It was touched upon a bit in the readings. It wasn't on gold, it was something else. Happened here near Kimberley. Diamonds were discovered. And originally the owners that came to own that, people rushed from all over the world to try and get that. And what the state said, they first said that blacks can't own that. And you could only work, originally some blacks actually owned some of the mines. They then passed an law, said you can't be black and own a mine.
No.
Then what happened is they passed another law. There were two powerful men that emerged at this time. One guy called Barney Bonato and another one Cecil John Rhodes. They were capitalists. They originally came from Britain, but they had ties through their families to banks in Britain. And they had ties to the colonial state, well, specifically Rhodes, not so much Bonato. But what they did was, eventually the state says that only two companies can own diamonds in South Africa. One of them still exists. It's called De Beers. That used to be owned by Rhodes. So the state plays a role, and it says only a few people can actually own these mines, and it's two. They own like a corporation. The Oppenheimers actually buy into that later on. They get involved. But what happens is they need workers for the mines. So you had people that were conquered like the Khoisan, they work on the farms. But now you're looking for people to work on the mines as capitalists. So what they originally came up with ideas, they said we'll bring white workers from Europe. They start doing that, they find problems because the white workers were actually unionized in the past. So they want higher wages. At one point they even thought we'll bring, this is later on, they said we'll bring Chinese workers because they're cheap. We'll just import them from China and make them work. Eventually what they decide is we need cheap labor, and they look to black labor as cheap labor. Does anyone know how they get people to work? Part of it says hut taxes, but that's not the whole story. They go to war, comrades. The Anglo-Zulu War, the Pedi, Tswana, the Lesotho, even here on this border, and they push people off the land because then you don't have a way to work. And then those that remain in the land, the state says to them, well, now you have to pay a hut tax. You have to pay tax for your head of your cattle, and you need money to do that. You can't pay in tribute. So it starts changing, and capitalism starts emerging. And then what they do is when people don't actually pay that, either because they don't want to pay it or they can't pay it, they arrest them. And they ship them off to Kimberley. And they work as prisoners in the mines first. And the first, you heard of Marikana, the mining compounds. The first mining compound was a prison. And then they put the O's to work. They were black workers that didn't pay hut taxes. And you force people into the economy of capitalism, and then you pay them really low wages. And the state enforces this. So if you don't pay, you go to prison. So you have to get ways of getting money. There's also people that were looking to try and resist, so they also had an interest in trying to get money to buy guns, etc. But it's mainly people that were forced, because the only way you could get money is to go and work on the mines, because you didn't own anything because it was taken away. Even if you did, you had a hut tax, and the way you could only pay the hut tax in money. So you were arrested if you couldn't. So people start migrating. But the state says, no, we don't want like the whole black population moving to the cities. You had a white working class. But they don't. So they didn't want like black people living in the cities that were emerging, partly because they thought it as a threat. So what you do is they implemented the pass laws. So they said, well, you can't come into town. You as a man can come into town. You as a woman must stay back in the rural areas. You can see the legacy today as well. It's still kind of doesn't exist, but you can see the legacy. And what they do is, when people go out on strike, they use the state to smash that. So you keep wages low. The police come. They shoot people. There was actually, in 1922, white miners went out on strike. They were shot as well. But the state gave them stuff because they were worried. So that's how you have a white section a broad section that's got welfare. It was from a strike on the mines. But the whole thing is set up in a way that the state backs mining capital in South Africa throughout the colonial period, throughout apartheid. So the whole aim of apartheid, it was partly to take land, but that wasn't the main issue. It was to take land to create labor that would work on the mines for very little. And in 1946, comrades were organizing black mine workers. The first black union emerges on the mines as well in 1918. So comrades start gradually organizing. Each time the state tries to smash them, it sends the police. And the reason it does it is because when you go out on strike, you're demanding higher wages, the state stops that, or tries. People can organize, they also win sometimes, but that's what the state was doing. So it wanted to keep the wages low. Why? Because then you paying workers less means your profits more as a capitalist. That's what they were doing. So the whole system of apartheid was actually to have a black population that would sell its labor, but sell it very cheaply. And you can see the legacy of this in terms of why black working class areas are impoverished. It's not an accident. It didn't come from nowhere. Mm-hmm. So it's part of how capitalism emerged in South Africa and the form it took. In Europe, you have a white working class that exists. So you can have working class that are different. Even in South Africa, you have a section of, they're quite small, but they're all white working class people. But the basis of South Africa's profits, especially mining, comes from very cheap black labor. And the state played a role in keeping that very cheap. So every time you resisted, send the police. You don't want women coming into town, you have pass laws. You don't want people having access to the land because you want them to work, you pass the 1913 Land Act. So it's a whole systematic thing. You have industries that develop from this. So you have a sugar industry in KwaZulu-Natal that's developed to feed the mining areas with sugar and food. So you start having agriculture changes from being like you're just producing to survive to you're producing to sell on the mines. And in KwaZulu-Natal, they introduced big fields where they bring Indian labor. That's how Indian people came here. They came as laborers. They're almost forced laborers. They're like semi-slaves. And you were forced to work on the plantations here by KwaZulu-Natal. You also have like manufacturing, but our manufacturing isn't geared towards meeting people's needs. It's geared towards mining. So you have explosives, like a big explosive industry in South Africa. It's geared towards mining. So a lot of our economy is not to meet people's needs, it's to meet the needs of the mining houses. The mining houses are like Anglo-American, Lonman, something called, what's the other one? Goldfields, Motsepe owned part of that. So you have, that's what the whole state and how capitalism came about in South Africa. It's designed to keep the system going.